And I
One
missed
thing that I
last
did
week.
was I set this series of Zoom meetings up. In the advanced options, you can set it up to automatically record, which I did, but I hadn't seen that it was actually recording yet. So I was double checking.
I missed last week when you talked about the water system.
Yeah.
And I don't know where to go to find that recording.
I posted it on the UPC's Facebook page. Do you have
Okay.
access to that?
Yes.
The public one, not the private one.
Right.
If you just scroll down to the post, it should be there. And when you click on the link, it will download the video file.
Okay.
Which may take a while because they're all pretty big.
Okay.
Well, I don't know whether we're going to have a big group, but why don't we go ahead and start? And if others join us, we will do so. So to begin with, let me do my share screen. And then put it on projector. There we go. So the topic today, and I'm not sure that I have as much today as I've had in the past, but we'll see. Plan to talk about science and medicine in Cuba. This has been a challenge to find information on this, and some of what I've found is contradictory. It's kind of like the quotation by Abraham Lincoln that you can find anything on the internet. You can't always trust what you find, but I've tried to winnow the facts. So the focus really here is on what has happened since the revolution when Castro overthrew Batista. One of the explicit philosophies that Fidel Castro declared and acted on was that there would be free access to free healthcare for everybody, and also universal access to education. So one of Castro's first acts was to set up and enforce that there would be a universal, literacy requirement, and he would prioritize knowledge building and discovery. So he also acted to invest in science, education, and development. So since the beginning of the revolution and his initial steps there has been steady progress in both education and in science and in medicine, despite setbacks caused by the U.S. embargo and also the loss of Russia as Cuba's primary financial supporter in 1991, which began when the period of special times began. So the embargo and now the depressed economy in Cuba and now that the pandemic have all constrained progress, but they made some pretty good progress anyway, despite that. This is a slide from the very first meeting we had as a group that represented some demographics. If we compare some of the health statistics between Cuba and the United States, although the birth rate's declining in Cuba, it's slightly lower than the United States, 9.92 births per 1,000 citizens versus 11.6 in the United States. Fertility rate, the number of children that a woman has in her reproductive career, career is a bad word choice. I'm reflecting back to my veterinary environment. I haven't quite shifted my brain during her life of reproductive capacity. In Cuba, women have 1.45 children on average. In the United States, it's more, 1.71. The death rate is lower in Cuba than it is in the United States, but the life expectancy is pretty much about the same. So the declining birth rate and the declining death rate are probably gradually going to increase life expectancy. Cuba certainly has a better infant mortality rate, 4.76 versus 5.8 in the United States per 1,000 births. So the health picture in Cuba certainly looks good in comparison to that in the United States. Now, statistics are one thing. Day to day on the streets in Cuba is a little bit different, and I'll try to talk about some of that as we go ahead. In terms of literacy rate, which is defined as people above the age of 15 who can read and write, and based on a 2015 estimate, for Cuba it was 99.8%, essentially the entire population. The same source listed the United States as 86%, which is significantly lower. And in fact, the United States listed as number 125 on a list of 197 countries. So the United States doesn't have any bragging rights on literacy.
And if you were to compare Louisiana to Cuba, it probably is a lot worse.
Probably a lot worse. That's certainly the case. Although I think illiteracy in the United States is probably, my sense is that in big cities, inner cities, that's probably an area where there's a serious problem. I found some United Nations information for the year 2012. Literacy in Cuba for youth is 99.9, for adults 99.8, and for elderly 99.2. So that sort of gives that 99.8 average. What is interesting is that the United States does not report literacy data to the United Nations or many other data gathering groups. Within our own country, the National Institute for Literacy, which is a literacy advocacy group, they estimate that 32 million adults are unable to read. And of course, that contributes to chronic unemployment, low self-esteem, and the kind of jobs they qualify for are much lower. But again, the U.S. rarely publishes an overall literacy rate. They actually try to split literacy into 4 different kinds and give data on that. So it's kind of hard to compare apples to oranges there. So in Cuba, here's how their educational system works. Attendance is compulsory from ages 6 to 16. So 16 or 17 is the end of the basic secondary education. 6 to 15 or 16. It is not legal to have homeschooling in Cuba. And one of the things we heard at the Cuba Partners Network meeting last weekend, they were talking about some of the evangelicals that are coming to Cuba and have created quite an uproar. One of the...
George, I can hardly hear you.
Is this any better?
Yeah, your voice fades in and out.
Okay, maybe it's because I'm turning my head. I'll try. I've got this on my computer plus the TV, so Pat can see it, and I'm probably turning my head away. I'm sorry. Thanks to give me feedback there. We heard at the Cuba Partners Network meeting about an evangelical pastor that had come to Cuba and got in trouble. He was refusing to send his children to the public schools. He wanted to homeschool them. That's just kind of as an aside. But in the schools, they all wear uniforms, and the color of the pants on the boys and the skirt on the girls, or the shorts, indicates what level of school they're in. Primary education is grades 1 through 6. Secondary education is divided into 2 sequential phases: basic secondary education and then pre-university secondary education. At the end of the basic secondary education, there are 2 pathways they can choose. They can choose between a pre-university education, maybe there are 3 here, it's hard to figure this out, but they've got a pre-university education and then technical and professional education. And I could not find out whether the technical and professional were the same or 2 different pathways. I know, for example, the people who go to medical school go straight out of high school. And that, to me, that would be professional education. those who complete the pre-university education are awarded a bachelor's degree or a baccalaureato. But they also, after that essentially high school diploma, they can go on and get a bachelor's degree and even master's and PhD degrees. The technical track, which I think is similar to a trade school, leads to two sequential levels of qualification. The first one is skilled workers, and then middle level technicians. So if you successfully complete this cycle of kind of what we might call community colleges, trade school related community colleges, after they complete those two levels, they can go on then to work in technological institutes or go for advanced training in technological institutes. So this is not, if I'm interpreting it right, this is not only plumbers and electricians, but it's also computer technicians and the more technical. There has been a problem in Cuba, though, since about the 2010s, for about the last 10 years. There's been a shortage of educators in primary and secondary schools throughout the island, which means that the schools are understaffed. So although school attendance is compulsory, and it's compulsory until you hit 15 or 16, there's a shortage of teachers in these schools. And they try to specify teacher to student ratios, but that is a bit problematic. I can't say for sure that it's a consequence of the shortage, but there now are private educational opportunities included. Private schools to teach English and other supplemental skills. English is taught in Cuban schools. I think everybody has to take some of it. But there apparently is private education available to people who choose to pursue it. At the university level, there are more than 60 universities in Cuba. The oldest one is the University of Havana, which was founded in 1727. And for comparison, Harvard was founded in 1636 and Yale in 1701. But the University of Havana is the oldest university in Cuba and the most highly regarded. I believe I may have mentioned when I was talking about the history of Cuba and talking about the revolution, that once the Castro revolution occurred, not only did they nationalize a lot of businesses, but they nationalized all of the educational institutions too. And there was a very highly regarded Presbyterian college, I believe it was in Cardenas, that was institutionalized as a part of this process. Some of you may remember this young lady on the upper left. This is Giselle Perez Yanez. We first met her when we went to Cuba in 2012 with our youth group in that summer. So that's 8 years ago, and she was this kind of gangly, awkward, but very friendly and engaged young girl. Just today, I got this notice that she has gotten her bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Havana. And I think the other people in this picture, Dr. Claudia Felipe is her tutor, her advisor. And I think the rest of these may have been the exam committee that she had to go before to complete her degree. Because the guy on the lower left is listed as the opponent, or he's the one who led the final evaluation examination. There's also a Master of Science person, Ainsley Torres. And the LIC means, it's like writing a BA or a BS after your name. So that Dianette Quintana must have been another art history graduate who was part of the examination committee. But Giselle, it's been fun to watch her blossom as we've communicated over the years. She will sometimes at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night start dialogue with me through Facebook Messenger. And once she gets started, it's hard to stop because she's got all these things. She sends me pictures, she sends me videos. So it's been kind of nice to have, this friendship develop. Her thesis, she had to do a thesis for her baccalaureate degree, and it was on the architecture of historic churches in Cuba. And she is the one that actually dug up for me those old pictures of our partner church in San Jose that I showed earlier. I'm not sure, I haven't had a chance to ask her, I'm not sure where she goes next. Because one of the issues of education, higher education in Cuba, is that often people pick a career or pick a curriculum to become a career based on opportunities that may be available in their area. So if you live in a small town like San Jose de los Ramos, and you go to school to become a civil engineer, people don't have mobility. So someone that graduated from San Jose with that engineering degree would likely have a very hard time finding work relevant to their training in that town. And because it's not easy to move, houses are not sold easily like they are here. So people often choose the curriculum they're going to follow for college training based on where they are likely to find a job in the near area, rather than on what might be of most interest to them. Now, Giselle did go from San Jose to Havana for college. And I'm sure there was an admissions process, although there's a guarantee of universal education, at least through secondary level. I think she probably had to be competitive to be admitted into this program. But she was able to have all these dialogues with me on Facebook Messenger because she was in the university housing. And though she had access to the university's internet, somebody back in San Jose probably would not have that flexibility and the ability to go for several hours of back and forth communication like we do sometimes. But Giselle is delightful. We have had political disagreements as we've debated back and forth. But I think I consider her a friend, and I'm pleased to see her success. So the question is, what's she going to do now? Maybe she'll be a teacher, an art teacher. I'm not sure. I don't know what kind of opportunities there are for someone with an art history degree, unless she's already in Havana. Maybe she could find housing. Maybe she could work on a museum. I don't know. I'm going to have to query her about what her future plans and options are. So I want to talk a little bit about science in Cuba. And this is an article that actually I found in the journal Nature. Can Cuba Science Go Global was the title. And it was a discussion about the state of, and this was in 2016, it was about the state of science in Cuba just as Obama's era was ending. So they described it as Cuban science at a crossroads. When Obama, as president, eased restrictions on Cuba, there was a lot of hope, tourism and all kinds of other things, but in the science community, there was a hope that research would really blossom and grow. But the expectations have not been met. And then once Trump became elected, he has one by one managed to cancel and even make worse the restrictions that Obama had put into place. Nevertheless, the research community in Cuba, especially in biomedical research, has really grown because Fidel Castro invested in this quite a bit. His investments were not as strong in some of the other areas of science and engineering and technology, but he really pushed on the development of biomedical research. And as a result, Cuba has been quite successful in developing low-cost vaccines, cancer treatments, and an excellent screening system for health disorders in infants. Other areas of science got less support, but there were still areas where there's strength. Cuba has been very strong in hurricane monitoring, in infectious disease monitoring, and also in ecology. Because of the embargo, a lot of the natural zones of Cuba are pristine. So there are coral reefs, a lot of stuff on the Isle of Juvenal, and on the southern coast of Cuba are wonderful places for ecological research. I vaguely recall that one of the smallest hummingbird in the world is in Cuba, and some of the smallest frogs in the world are in Cuba. So there's a lot of ecology and natural science, natural history, where there's opportunity for a lot of knowledge from studies in Cuba. Some of the downsides of the Cuban support for science and research is that people in research positions get very low pay. The number of people willing to study for PhD degrees is low. And the reality is, in areas of science, if you don't have PhD students, you don't get as much accomplished. It's when you have a team of people working in your lab that you make a lot of progress. And collaborative research is mostly the norm in science today. They also face problems of exodus of young scientists who leave to go to other countries. Because of the embargo, there's difficulty in identifying collaborators for research in other countries, especially the United States. And of course, the United States is one of the world leaders in research. So this is a country where they would love to do collaboration, but it's hard to pull off. And a real big problem they face is the inability to afford the purchase of laboratory equipment, which increasingly becomes more and more specialized. It's a problem for me. It's a problem in the United States to be able to keep up with it. When Cuba can't get it because of the embargo, it's really hard for them to be able to make advances in their areas of research. Just like in other areas like car repair, Cuban scientists are very creative in finding solutions, but it does impede their efforts. In this article that was in 2016, it said in the last 6 years, Cuba had spent between 0.3 and 0.6% of its gross domestic product on research and development annually, which is high in Latin America, but it's not as high as Brazil, where it's 1.2, or the United States, where it's 2.7%. Also, the government for years has promised that they were going to set up something equivalent to the National Science Foundation of the United States, where researchers in Cuba could apply for and secure competitive grant funding to advance their research. So the accessibility for research funding within the country mostly relies on international sources, and it's hard to find funding from another country, no matter where you live. Now, within the budget of the government, there is funding available for research, at least in certain areas, such as biomedical. But the budgets are very strict, so you can get some funding for your research, but to publish the research, nowadays most journals have gone to what's called an open access format, where anybody can see the journal article and get it for free, but you as the author of the publication have to pay several $1,000s. And that makes up for the fact that you don't have a physical journal that can have ads in it and other sources of revenue to keep the journal going. So as the United States and other developed countries have gone more and more to these open access journals, researchers in Cuba can't afford to pay those fees. I published 2 papers this spring. They actually came out with a week of each other in 2 different journals. And between the 2 of them, I paid $6,000 in publication fees. So researchers in Cuba don't have the resources to do that. What that means is then that they have to publish in the small number of Cuba published research journals, which are low circulation and do not have much readership outside of Cuba, which means that your findings and your research do not get disseminated very well. And it also means that you have limited access to research by people in other countries like the United States, because to be able to get internet access to journals, whether they're open access or not, you've got to have good internet sources. So it's very challenging for the Cuban scientists to be able to keep up with what is the state of knowledge in their discipline. And it's extremely difficult to disseminate their own findings in the way that we are supposed to do it in research. So these funding issues create problems for people to be able to replicate the research, which is one of the things that we do in science. We have peer review, but we also need to be able to replicate somebody's work, confirm that it's real. And it makes it also hard to do collaborations. So the scientists in Cuba face a lot of hurdles. And there's more. Graduate students in Cuba not only have to defend their thesis among their committee members and major professor like we do here in the United States, but they have to do a second defense before a national tribunal that ensures that the project will be of service to Cuba. So if Giselle wanted to do a master's degree on the architecture of Cuban churches, this tribunal would have to be somehow convinced that that would be beneficial to Cuba for them to allow her to do advanced study in that area. Of course, she's not in science. But this tribunal also means that you don't have two different students in Cuba working on the same problem. It's kind of a gatekeeper to try. I guess the idea is to maximize resources so that you don't have duplication of effort, which from a bookkeeper's perspective might be a good idea. From a science perspective, having duplication of studies is part of how we validate the findings of ourselves and others. One of the biggest areas.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is that on the master's and the PhD level, or just the PhD level?
It didn't say for sure, but I assume both. The article where I read that, that article in Nature just said graduate students, so I don't know whether to assume that it's both levels or just the doctoral level.
Yeah, because I know here you have to have original research for a PhD. It can be in the same topic, but it has to be a totally different procedure and objectives and all that. So I was just wondering if it was.
Well, but that's also true usually for master's students, at least in my area. Mm-hmm. They have to do original research too. Just the magnitude and scope of the research project for the master's is smaller.
Smaller, yeah.
But there are some master's degrees that are non-research. So it's more just 2 years of additional coursework without any research involved. But that's not that common.
Okay.
One of the areas of science that has been very well supported by the Cuban government is that of biotech. And this is out of academia now, although there are linkages to academia, but this is also biotech industry. They have the advantage that they can pursue areas of research where they don't have to worry about profitability. If I were to go work for Upjohn Pharmaceuticals, I could have an area of interest where I would be involved in drugs on a certain, say for epilepsy. And as long as that was within the priorities of the drug company, they would be okay with me working on that research. But if I wanted to choose a completely different area that was not part of their priorities, as an industry employee, I didn't have that freedom. But in Cuba, in the biotech industry, they've got the option to be able to explore areas they want and a lot more freedom. They don't have to worry about making a profit off of a product that they might develop. An example of the creativity of scientists in Cuba solving problems, there was a group that wanted to have a primate research lab. And it was for a biotech company called C-Neuro, and I'll mention what that is later. But they couldn't afford to purchase primates. So they went to the island of St. Kitts, which has a veterinary school, a medical school, they're for-profit schools. And St. Kitts has a serious problem of vervet monkeys that are considered pests, agricultural pests. They destroy crops. They're really obnoxious. My department just got somebody for a department head candidacy who actually has a startup company on St. Kitts where he maintains a primate colony there and provides health validated monkeys for research purposes there. So, and it started from the wild animals on the island when he started this facility. So this researcher in Cuba hitched a ride on a freighter, got a ride to St. Kitts. They captured 25 vervet monkeys and brought them back to Cuba to start a primate research laboratory. So just like fixing their cars, they can get pretty creative in being able to find ways to make advance on their research. Something else that one of these biotech companies did was developed a hearing aid for children that only cost the equivalent of $2 US. Now, my hearing aids cost me, I think, $4,000. And these low-cost hearing aids, the casing that fits into the ear, they can produce new casings with a 3D printer as the child grows and the ear canal gets larger. And the electronics inside transfer to the new housing. So it's interesting to see how creative they've been. Here's some data out of that paper from Nature, comparing some Latin American countries, Argentina, Chile, Cuba, and Mexico. First of all, their population, Cuba is the smallest population of these four countries with 11.2 million. And you look, it shows how many researchers there are per million inhabitants. And surprisingly, Mexico, which is the largest country, has the fewest per capita researchers. Argentina is way ahead of everybody else. Cuba is essentially the same as Mexico. And that asterisk just means that these were in two different years, sequential years. Where do I have that? The asterisk is 2013 data, everything else is 2014. So Cuba does not have that many researchers per capita, and they're the smallest country. So total head count of researchers is going to be, relatively smaller than any of these other Latin American countries. The spending by the government on research as a percent of GDP, Chile was the lowest. Cuba is not, and I said earlier that it was reasonably high for Central America. One of my sources said it was one of the highest in highest in Latin America, except for Brazil. Well, that's not quite true here. Obviously, Cuba is more than Chile, but less than Mexico or Argentina in terms of the national government spending as a percentage of their GDP. The number of doctorates issued by field, it's smallest for Cuba compared to Mexico, Chile, or Argentina. And the 1, 2, 3, 4 represents agricultural sciences, medical sciences, engineering and technology, and then natural sciences and mathematics. With the emphasis in Cuba on biotechnology, I would have expected that to fall under medical sciences, but maybe it's under number 3, engineering technology. Maybe that's where they're being counted. But the number of PhD students being given doctoral degrees in Cuba is not high. Now, Cuba does have its own national body to recognize outstanding people in the sciences. The Academia de Ciencias de Cuba, or the Cuban Academy of Sciences, has been around a long time. It's said to be the oldest national academy of sciences outside of Europe. It was founded in 1861, which was before the War of Independence from Spain, which we call the Spanish-American War. By comparison, the United States National Academy of Sciences was not founded until, it was founded 2 years later, 1863 instead of 1861. The headquarters for the Cuban Academy of Sciences is in the National Capitol Building, which is that picture there, in Havana, and it's under the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Environment. The National Academy of Sciences in the United States is in Washington, D.C. I've been to their building. It's an independent nonprofit, and it actually includes 3 different academies: the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the Institute of Medicine. So those 3 bodies together cover the areas of the Cuban Academy of Science, which is agrarian and fishery sciences, biomedical sciences. I don't know what exact sciences are, but exact and natural sciences, social sciences and humanities, and technical sciences. So this is equivalent to our National Academy of Sciences, Institute of Medicine, and National Academy of Engineering. So one of the neat things they've done, one of the good things they've done in Cuba, and this was a reaction to Fidel Castro's vision. They set up what they call scientific polos. In Havana, we have the Polo Científico del Este de la Habana, the scientific pole of the west of Havana. And this is, in essence, a research park. This was founded in 1991. Later, there were several different poles or thematic research parks developed in addition to this one. There was one on industrial theme, and there's one on humanities, both in Havana. And then they started developing research parks throughout the country. So the first 2 were in Villa Clara and in Santiago de Cuba. There are now 15 of these. This was created with, and this is in quotes, with the aim of promoting the development of biotechnology, the medical, pharmaceutical industry, and advanced technologies, to solve health problems, and I assume they mean to solve food problems, provide foreign currency to the country through competitive products. So the idea is to develop marketable products that they can sell to the rest of the world to provide a revenue stream to fund the research that gets done in these research parks. In the early years of this first poll, they developed several products of note. They developed a meningococcal vaccine and a recombinant hepatitis B vaccine. Also of significance, they developed something that they called the Ultra Micro Analytical Diagnostic System, or SUMA. And it's a system that uses ELISA-based tests. I'll explain that. To run initially 23 different kits that were diagnostic for 15 different pathologies. And ELISA, that's short for enzyme-linked immunoassay. So an ELISA is a test that uses an antibody to a protein or a gene segment that's somehow linked to a disease. It's an advanced technology. It's been in American science for a good number of years, but it's still cutting-edge technology. And they sell these SUMA systems all throughout Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And just recently, they used the concept to develop an assay for COVID-19 testing when the pandemic broke out. So they very quickly developed this test, and they've been doing testing in Cuba for COVID virus religiously. So now here's where things start getting confusing to me, because they're different names for the same things, same organizations. So I mentioned that this West Havana poll was established in 1991. The Immunoassay Center, the Centro de Immunoensayo, was formed by Castro in 1982 and based on one source. Another one said 1994, so I'm not sure which is first. But this Immunoassay Center is in Havana, and it is part of that poll in Western Havana poll. So this center, like all the other groups in the poll, the research park, don't get a budget from the central government. Instead, they are state companies within a group that's called BioCuba Pharma. And these companies are a business group, and they completely finance their own research and development, their manufacturing, their marketing, training, and technical assistance through sales. So by selling their vaccines or their diagnostic kits, they generate the money, more feedstock to do more research. Between 2008 and 2013, this BioCuba Pharma raised $2.5 billion US in revenue. And they also manufacture a lot of their own scientific research equipment, since it's nearly impossible to buy anything from the United States. And if they buy equipment from other countries that is manufactured in the United States, those US companies get hammered by our State Department if it becomes public knowledge. So these businesses in the research parks are self-funding, self-sustaining. So I said earlier that the biotech industry does not have to have profitability as a factor. That's probably not completely true, because if these businesses in the BioCuba Pharma are not bringing in income, there's not going to be much more development happening. So I found a report that this BioCuba Pharma put together, and it describes that they have 13 different businesses within the various poles. They've got 78 manufacturing facilities, and this CIE right here, that's that immunology center. I mentioned C-Neuro, that's a business that develops products for neurologic disorders. Some of these are agricultural and so on. So within BioCuba Pharma, they say they've got almost 22,000 workers. 6,000 of them have university bachelor's degrees. There are 262 PhDs, 1,170 people with master's degrees. And then, I don't know what these are. They just say researchers. I don't know if these are technicians, probably technicians. But I don't know whether they have a bachelor's degree or not. But this is the scope of these 15 or so research parks now that have developed. This is a list of the different products that they've developed. So in the years 81 to 90, 1981 to 1990, they had that meningitis vaccine. They developed interferon alpha 2B, which would be used, I believe, as a therapeutic agent to try and stimulate the immune system. And they developed the SUMA diagnostic system. And then in the next 10 years, all these other, here's the SUMA system. In the next 10 years, they developed all these products. And then from 2001 through 15, all these. So these these businesses are obviously being very productive in growing their product, commercial products. So it seems like they've got a pretty successful financial model to be able to utilize their scientific brain trust and develop products that are useful. They have 91 products that are now available. 33 are products against infectious diseases. 33 are involved in cancer. 18 with cardiovascular disease, and 7 with diabetes and other pathologies. So that adds up to 91. And on the right, it shows you projects that they have in progress. So, for example, in cancer-related conditions, they're working on 254 different products right now that they're trying to develop. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, infectious diseases. They do have genetic disorders, eye conditions, AIDS, neurologic, and so on. But cancer and infectious diseases and cardiovascular diseases and diabetes are the big ones. I think those are probably the most common health problems in Cuba. And they are practical in what they do, no question of that. So here's one of the outcomes of the products that came out of this BioCuba Pharma, and that's this SUMA technology. One of the strong areas, medical areas in Cuba, is that they have a national newborn screening program. So they take a little blood sample from every child that's born. They call them DBS samples. That means dried blood spot. So there's probably just a heel prick, just enough to get a little drop of blood. They put it on a card, and they send it to the city medical genetics reference center. All the major cities, many of the smaller cities have these, and each one has one of these SUMA technology devices in them. And the screening is done with SUMA to identify whether any of these children have the diseases that they're testing for. And if they get a positive here, and I want to point out, it is an immunoassay, and they're working with a small size sample that's been dried and probably has not been refrigerated. So there may be some false positives here. But if they do get a positive from the SUMA test, then a second blood sample is drawn. They take a serum sample, a larger volume, and they send that to a regional center for confirmation. If that second sample tests negative, then they assume the first test was a false positive, and there's no further action. But if the second sample confirms that the child has the disorder, they are assumed to be positive for the disorder, and they are then referred to a specialist pediatrician for evaluation and treatment if it's possible. There's a national registry maintained of all these diagnostic tests overseen by the Ministry of Public Health. And there's actually an article here in a journal called Journal of Inborn Errors of Metabolism and Screening, where this flowchart came from. So the development of this SUMA system by the POL, or the Immunoassay Center, or the BioCuba Pharma, they all take credit for this. So the development of that SUMA system has enabled this nationwide screening program of all newborn infants.
By the way, George, we do that here too.
Do we?
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, we do.
And we also screen new infants for deafness and all kinds of other things too. So but I think that it'd be interesting to see how uniform it is here. You know more than that than me.
Every baby born has to have that. Check for if they have inborn errors of metabolizing milk. They check for,
PKU probably.
right. They check for sickle cell anemia, And I forget what, there are like 5 or 6 different things that every baby gets tested for. And it's on a card just like that. Yeah.
One of the other products that has come out of this BioCuba Pharma is a drug called Semavex EGF. The generic name for it is Nimotuzumab. I can't even say it, but it ends with MAB, which means monoclonal antibody. A lot of the medicines that you see described on our TV now are what are called biologics. And they're products that have been developed using monoclonal antibodies to either a disease-causing virus or bacteria, or something that an antibody can attach to in an affected person. So this is one of their big early wins. They spent 20 years at the Immunoassay Center developing this, and it's a drug specifically for non-small cell lung carcinoma. It's a combination of human epidermal growth factor, which is not, I don't know if you call it a hormone, but it's a chemical produced by the body that leads to growth. The growth factor is pretty obvious in the name. So it's got the human epidermal growth factor produced in a bacterial culture. That's the recombinant. And it's hooked onto a protein character. One of the features of many cancers is that the cancer hijacks the natural receptor in the body for the epidermal growth factor. So this drug, this antibody to epidermal growth factor, locks up and eliminates a lot of the molecule in the bloodstream. And the cancers need it to grow the tumors. So by reducing access to this needed growth stimulant, the epidermal growth factor, they are starving the cancers. So this is a drug for treating already existing cancer. It's not a vaccine to prevent a cancer, but it's been very successful. It's cheap to produce and store, low toxicity, mild side effects. There was a paper published in the U.S. Journal in 2016 where they looked at 400 people, and it showed that the drug could increase survival time for people with non-small cell carcinoma by a year, which is not insignificant. The drug has been approved for use in 4 Latin American countries, and it's pending approval in others. They have started a trial for this in the United States. As far as I can tell, it's only at a place called the Roswell Institute, a major medical center. But getting a drug approved in the United States, as we've all heard, is difficult and takes a long time. But I've heard stories about Americans with cancers actually going illegally to Cuba to get treatment with this drug because they can't get it in the United States. Now, the Cuban Constitution and subsequent laws have set out a set of principles on public health. First of all, healthcare is a right available to all equally and free of charge. Now, I'll mention about whether free of charge is true, but that's the philosophy. Healthcare is the responsibility of the state. Preventive services and treatment or curative services should be integrated. So there's a heavy emphasis on preventive medicine and public health. The public participates in the health system's development and functioning, so there's a lot of back and forth feedback and the opportunity to suggest improvements in the system. And global health cooperation is a fundamental obligation of the health system and its professionals, which I take to mean collaboration outside of the country's borders to the extent that it's possible. And this also will relate to the medical missions that many Cuban doctors do, and I'll talk about in a little bit. There's an interesting article in the American Journal of Public Health published in 2012 titled "The Curious Case of Cuba," talking about the public health system in Cuba and how it works and how it compares to that of the United States and what the United States might learn from it. So if you want to be a doctor in Cuba, they have a medical education system. There are 16 medical schools, one in each province. And Cuban students enter directly from secondary school, from high school. They do take international students. We heard at the Cuba Partners Network meeting this last weekend that there was a woman there who spoke. She works with a group that tries to place Americans in medical school in Cuba. And she said that the U.S. students who want to go to medical school in Cuba need at least 2 years of college before they'll be accepted there. Plus, they need Spanish. And they do offer immersion programs in Spanish in Cuba for Americans. But to handle a medical curriculum requires significant language skills, I believe. And to follow up on that, Cuba provides state-subsidized education, medical school education to foreign nationals under a variety of specific programs, including United States students who are trained as MDs at the Latin American School of Medicine, which is acronym is ELAM. It's not as extensive, I found out, as I've been led to believe. There have been about 100 students go through the program so far, but the program provides full scholarships, including meals and housing. And then their graduates are expected to return to the United States to offer low-cost health care in low-income areas. This ELAM school is huge. They have nearly 20,000 students from 110 countries. That was the enrollment in 2013. It just boggles my mind. LSU has about 30,000 students altogether. So if you think about 2/3 of the students at LSU being medical school students, that's a phenomenally sized group of people. Of interest to me, there are also 4 schools of veterinary medicine in Cuba. And I got the chance to stop at one, and I drove past the one in Havana. The orientation of the veterinary schools has been mostly on agricultural species. So that's livestock like cattle, pigs, goats, and horses. But more and more they are including companion animal emphases too, so dog and cat type pets. On one of our very first trips to Cuba, we were staying at the Presbyterian Church in Veradero at the Dora Arce Valentin Church, Dopico's church. And at the house next to the church, there was a veterinarian on the front porch doing medical treatments, including neuters and spays. He was doing essentially pro bono work on stray animals, and I believe some of it paid. He didn't speak English. I speak essentially no Spanish, as Lorinda can tell you. But we become Facebook friends, so we communicate regularly. So I get sort of a behind the scenes picture of veterinary practice in Cuba. And through him, I became Facebook friends with someone else in Cuba who is a breeder of Dalmatians and is involved in the show dog circuit in Cuba. So despite the poverty and everything else that faces so many Cubans, they still love their dogs. And there are people who focus on pure breeds like Dalmatian. The veterinarian that I met first has a Rhodesian Ridgeback. So it's interesting to me to have that kind of perspective since I teach in a veterinary school. I found an article written by someone from England who attended the Cuban medical school. And his perspective says emphasis is on primary health care and prevention. Preventive medicine is much more emphasized than I think it is here in the United States. He reported, and I can't verify these amounts, but he reported that the Cuban government spends roughly $300 US to $400 US per person per year on health care. The doctors don't get much. They earn he said, $64 per month. But the government brings in about $8 billion annually as a result of their overseas medical missions. So a lot of the people that graduate from medical schools in Cuba are sent to other countries, Venezuela, Brazil, throughout Africa, where they are paid by that host country, but the Cuban government takes a portion of that pay. This British guy reported that many of the doctors opt to be on these international missions because the salaries they receive are better, way better, than what they would get in Cuba, even though the Cuban government takes about a third of their revenue from working in that other country. But by sending so many thousands of doctors to other countries, it has actually produced a shortage within Cuba. So particularly with specialists, sometimes if someone needs to see a specialist, and there should be, I'll show you the model in a minute, there should be specialists very close within their province. They may have to go to another province because that specialist has gone on a medical mission to another country. And they may end up either traveling or having to wait to deal with this. Now, the U.S. government has recently been claiming that these medical missions are compulsory. I'm not so sure that I believe that, particularly because it comes from our current administration. But they are saying, the Trump administration has been saying, this is a form of human trafficking. And they've used it as a justification for further cracking down on Cuba. Nevertheless, it is true that physicians in Cuba are treated as a commodity for the state. They are part of a diplomatic or political or mission to other countries. In Brazil, the current president of Brazil, talked too long, when he came in, canceled the agreement with Cuba, so they were all sent home. He has since relented, and some of the Cuban doctors have gone back to Brazil, but it's been a contentious process. Cuba has a high number of doctors per capita, 67 for every 10,000. As I said, being a doctor is not the elite profession that it is here in the United States. Cuba's gross domestic product per capita is 1/10 that of the United States. And they lack access to drugs and equipment because of the U.S. embargo. But the life expectancy in Cuba is the same as ours. And that is thought to be because of their heavy emphasis on preventive medicine. And that everyone in the country is seen by doctor-nurse teams. Another interesting point is that Cuba has been a medical tourism site. About 20,000 people per year come to Cuba for medical procedures or treatments. And that has generated about $40 million a year. You may recall hearing that the past president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, developed cancer, and he came to Cuba between 2011 and 2013 for treatment. Then he died, and the strong relationship that Cuba and Venezuela had has been problematic since then. Venezuela had taken over Russia's role as the primary benefactor of Cuba, and Venezuela was the source of Cuban oil. Again, the Trump administration has been doubling down on their embargo, and they have been trying to block oil tankers from Venezuela to Cuba, saying that Cuba is supporting terrorism by supporting the incumbent government of Venezuela. I am at a loss for words for that, but that's the way it is right now. So in Cuba, they use an interesting model of a physician-nurse team. This family physician and nurse program is made up of an MD and a nurse as a team that serve a community group. So these are local teams. It's not in a centralized facility. They actually have government-built medical offices that are 2 stories, and either the physician or the nurse or both live upstairs. So they're available 24/7 for any needs in the community. They work to improve public health concerns like standing water for mosquito breeding, as well as medical care in the community. Twice a year, they do a community-wide assessment of the state of health in their community. And the teams make home visits to every family at least once a year to assess and evaluate their health. So these are house calls. Every family gets a house call at least once a year. And anybody that has a chronic illness is seen at least once every 3 months. Above the doctor-nurse teams, there are what are called polyclinics. These are community-based clinics that house specialists for primary care. So this would be cardiologists and neurologists and so on, as well as facilities for advanced lab testing and advanced diagnostic techniques. These polyclinics are located in every medium or large-sized Cuban committee, which means that the staff know the people in their community. Each polyclinic oversees 20 to 40 doctor and nurse teams. And there are then what are called basic work teams that oversee the doctor nurse teams reporting to the polyclinic. Here's where the free healthcare question comes in. Preventive medical care, diagnostic tests, and medication for hospitalized patients are free. But patients who are not hospitalized may be asked to pay some of their costs. This may include drugs that are prescribed on an outpatient basis, hearing testing, dental services, orthopedic processes like prosthetics, and wheelchairs and crutches. If they pay for them, they're usually low priced, but if someone is low income, they get them free. It's difficult to me to distinguish between who is low income and who can afford these things. So free healthcare is not necessarily free. And we know that they face incredible shortages. When we go down to Cuba, we always try to take over-the-counter medicines, vitamins, analgesics, sanitary products. They can't get those there. They can't get toothpaste in Cuba right now because of the embargo. So it's mostly free, but if you've got some money, we would be happy to take it. So here's the model. We have a community which is made up of about 1,500 people, 375 families. And for each one of these communities, this approximate size, there's a family doctor and nurse team that lives in a government clinic building. There are work teams that supervise and interact with all these doctor and nurse teams, and they report to the polyclinics. So for specialty care, the polyclinic would be primary treatment. And then above that, there are hospitals, which are secondary treatment. And then there are a few, 12 or so medical institutes, which would be tertiary medical therapy. So this leads to everyone having access to medical care in their community. So without a doubt, the resources in Cuba are a problem. Medical equipment is unavailable or outdated. Both over-the-counter and prescription medicines are scarce or even unavailable. Heard the story of someone who had to have a family member bring down analgesics because he was going to have a heart valve replacement, and they had no medicines for post-operative pain. They had to get a family member to bring them somehow from Cuba, from the United States. And it's also true that the quality and availability of healthcare is stratified. If you are a special person, if you've got a high status, you have better access to the best health care. I mentioned this book in one of the earlier sessions that I read recently. It's called The Cubans, Ordinary Lives in Extraordinary Times, which I think is a great read. It reads like a novel, and it follows a number of families from the Cuban Revolution up to modern day. And it talks about how one of the families that it follows is fairly prestigious. This is in the neighborhood of Guanabacoa, which is a neighborhood of Havana. And people who were high priority, high status, got access to the best physicians, the best specialists, the best resources, whereas someone from a lower status would see the community team and might not have access to needed medicines. So the free and equal is not always free, and it's not always equal in Cuba. But healthcare is widely available, usually at low cost. And unlike the United States, people do not become bankrupted and have to choose between medical care and putting food at the table because of the high cost of medical treatment, which is such a problem here in the United States. So just a brief, I'm getting close to wrap up. I always run over, I apologize. I'm a professor. We can't stop teaching and talking. Here's an experience that we had. I've got two experiences with Cuban medicine to describe to you. On one of our trips, my son Michael and I, we went to San Jose de los Ramos, and Michael was teasing somebody and they started chasing him. So he ran from the sanctuary to the side room, and they have a refrigerator in their side room. And you know, the refrigerators have these handles that have anchors at the top of the handle and at the bottom of the handle. The handle was missing, but these anchor posts were still there sticking out. And as Michael ran past, he sliced his shoulder open. So we went to the community clinic, the nurse doctor clinic. There was a male nurse and a female physician. And that clinic also had dental facilities and some other resources. And Lorinda and I went back and visited there another time, and we actually took some gifts back from Lorinda for the nurse that we met. So here's Michael in the clinic. They laid him down. You can see the gash that I'm sorry if this is too gruesome, but there's the gash that he got in his shoulder. And the doctor had just opened up the little surgery pack, needle holders, forceps, scalpel, suture, and so on. And she began to suture him up. And that's what it looked like when she finished, but her needle kept bending in Michael's skin. I don't know if the needle was bad or his skin was tough, but she kept having to take the needle and straighten it back out. But she did get it sutured up. Those sutures still need to be trimmed and bandaged. This is what it looked like a little bit later. He calls it his Cuba smile scar, and he's kind of proud about it. I had a different experience when Linda Walker and I took the youth group to Cuba in 2012. I went jogging with my daughter the night before we left, and I didn't realize it, but I developed a big blister in the bottom of my foot. I've got nerve damage, so I didn't feel it. So we flew to Cuba. We went down straight to San Jose de los Ramos, a little small town. And when we were there, my blister ruptured. And it looked like this. And an infection set in. I was trying to take care of it myself, but the infection started growing up my leg, and it got up to my ankle. I don't know if you can see the ankle's pretty swollen there, as is the foot. So a few days later, we got to Veradero, which is that's where Dopico's church is, and it's also a major tourist site. And we arrived at the church, and I went to Dopico, and I said, I think I need to see a doctor. He says, well, there's one right here in the sanctuary with me. I've been talking to him. Now, I never knew. I know Dopico has a brother who's a physician. So I don't know if this is his brother or not. But the physician took a look at it, shook his head. He didn't speak English. And he scribbled out a note and gave it to Leticia Ramos for ciprofloxacin. she went off and came back with a bottle full of Cipro for me to take. And I took it for a week. It cleared up the infection. Then it was another 5 years before I got the diabetic wound to heal from that blister. But there was no charge for my medical care. There was no charge for the medicine. Now, it may be that as a foreigner, I had access to the drugs that someone in Veradero might not have had. I didn't know enough to ask at the time. But nevertheless, free treatment, we both, I think, benefited from that.
In Veradero,
You're here, Michael. Good.
yeah, I flipped up my camera to show him the scar. But when we were in Veradero, when I was dealing with the scar and we were trying to track down antibiotics for me, because they asked me if I had antibiotics, and I commented that I had Neosporin, and the doctor just kind of waved his hand and said, "That'll be fine, use that." So that's what I was treating my wound with, which worked just fine. We were encouraged to get a second opinion because they have a special doctor's office in Veradero for foreigners, since such a small percentage of the people in that city at any given time are actually natives. It's almost entirely tourists. They have an entire separate medical system that's fully stocked for the tourists when they're there. But we never found the place because I got bad directions. But it's interesting to see, like, that even though they do have the nationalized healthcare system, and I got to a doctor with 2 RNs on hand 2.5 blocks away in a podunk farm town in the middle of nowhere with no notice, is impressive. But they have another polished tier for the people that are coming through as tourists too, I suppose, is the point I was getting towards.
Well, there was a time when the average Cuban couldn't go to Veradero. It was exclusively for tourists. I remember in 2004, when the youth group went, that was one of the impressions that Olivia brought back, and she was very upset about the fact that average Cubans couldn't go to Veradero. And
they could go there to work. They worked in the hotels, and that's
could work,
but they couldn't go to the beaches, and they could not stay at the hotels or live there.
Right.
It has loosened up some then, but I don't know how much.
Right. Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot more that we could have talked about in terms of medicine in Cuba, but at least that gives you kind of an outline view.
Yeah.
The more I dig, the more I want to find out.
Well, I just think that given the limited resources that they have, if we have the same, infant mortality rate?
We've got a better one. Cuba has a better infant mortality rate.
It's just amazing to me. And that's the power of preventive medicine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next week, the topic is one that Robbie suggested. I want to talk about the arts in Cuba. A little bit about the museums, dance, theater, music. It's a whole other area of Cuba. Every time we've gone down there, the local church in San Jose and other churches that we've gone to, they'll invariably have a small singing group with a variety of musical instruments. And they love to sing and perform. They'll have a keyboard. They'll probably have some kind of percussion, bongo drums or larger drums, and some just vocalists. But music is a big part of life in Cuba, I guess, because it's largely free, can be free.
I think it's much more deeply culturally rooted than that.
I agree. I'm pretty sure that's the case. Yeah, and that's something where I don't have that much knowledge, but on one of my trips I did with Kathy Pullman, and I visited the National Museum in Havana. Mm-hmm. I've got some pictures from then. That was kind of interesting. They are very big on dance there and theater. Havana has got all kinds of little nightclub kind of places that are very popular with young people. There is a symphony. So there's a lot to talk about. So I'll be digging into that and trying to pull that stuff together. Beyond that, one of our possibilities is to view the video that Lorinda told us about.
No,
Black and Latin.
Lori told us about it.
Lori, I'm sorry. Lori brought it up on Black in Latin America, and particularly the episode that includes Cuba. I bought the DVD. It's supposed to be coming, but apparently it's available on YouTube. So maybe I'll send out a poll. Do we want to just sit and watch that as one of our Wednesday meetings, or make it a homework assignment and then discuss it? So maybe I'll send something out and try to get a sense of whatever you would like to do as a group.
At this point in time, I'm morally opposed to additional homework.
Yeah, between Connor and Ian, you've had your fill, I know. So maybe just watching it would be something to do. I can put it in the DVD player on my computer, just the way I show my screen to do a PowerPoint. I can show the video the same way, if that's the preference. So I'll send out an email and ask for, try and get a consensus on that. But I
could
completely
probably
understand.
broadcast it from here a bit more stable. I have a stronger upstream connection to actually broadcast higher resolution video from here. If
Okay.
you like.
Okay, that might be good. Has my signal been breaking up for any of you? I didn't notice it tonight.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's actually your computer kept switching different audio inputs, so you kept flipping back and forth between mics.
Nerd.
Shut up.
Nerd.
Good to have one. Good to have a nerd around who gets it.
Yeah, there are many people at church that have benefited from that nerd.
Yeah.
Basically, George, I could understand you, but sometimes it sounded staticky or something.
Yes.
Okay. Well, Michael has his own server and network at his house just down the street from me. So maybe go down there and go from there. And we both have Cox internet, but my signal routinely breaks up. I've got an amplifier, but it doesn't seem to have solved that problem. I think Cox is not providing a very good signal. But the options, maybe if I paid their exorbitant rate for their high bandwidth, it might be better. I don't know. But nevertheless, I'm rambling, as I am prone to do. So with that, why don't I say good night to everybody and see you next week, okay?
Thank you.
Take
All
care.
right.
Thank you, George.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Lorinda.
Bye.
Hey, Robbie.